I'm here with my September wrap-up. Now, during the month of September, I read 6 books and a graphic novel, and way back in July, I read a comic book compilation, I guess is what it's called, or bind-up or something, and I forgot to talk about that, so that's what I'm going to start with today. So the comic book bind-up or compilation or whatever it's called was Age of Ultron, and I had started reading this in order to watch the new Age of Ultron movie because my boyfriend said that we weren't going to watch it unless I read the comic first, so I knew what was supposed to happen. After reading the comic, I understand why people who have read the comics hate the movies, because in the movie there's no X-Men, there's no Spider-Man, there's a lot of characters that are not involved in the movie that are main characters in the comics. That was really disappointing, especially since I love Spider-Man and I love X-Men, and I've never read the comics. I watched the TV shows back in the 90s. I love Spider-Man, I love the X-Men, and they're in this, but they're not in the movie, which is a huge disappointment. But I also understand why they would have to make changes between the comic and the movie, because the comic, at least this bind-up that has everything in it, I don't know how it would be if you were actually reading the comics in order. This is really confusing because it'll go from one universe and this certain set of characters. It'll be going and you'll be really getting into the story, and then all of a sudden that comic will end, and instead of like just flowing into the next comic or flowing into the separate universe, it's just boom, you're in a separate universe. It's really confusing. It made it really confusing. I only gave this a 3 out of 5 stars just because of that. I enjoyed the story, but it was really hard to follow because there was no flow from one comic universe to the next. And it was just like boom, boom, boom. You're like in Fantastic Four universe, you're in the X-Men universe. It's just bouncing back and forth, and there's no flow to it at all. And I understand that it's like universe has its own series, and I don't know if it would flow better if I had actually read like the series or not. Just this bind-up didn't flow well at all, and I only gave it a 3 out of 5 stars for that. So now on to the books that I actually read in September. Since I just did a comic, I'll show the graphic novel that I read in September, and that is Saga Volume 1. It's by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. I love fantasy, I'm getting into sci-fi, but one thing I love about those genres is that they have detailed descriptions of the time and what's going on in the universe and all of that stuff, and this is greatly lacking in all of that. It describes the characters and it describes a little bit of the immediate situation that they're in, but it doesn't really describe their world very much. There's hardly any world building. There's a lot of pretty pictures, but there's nothing actually saying how they got to where they're at or anything like that. And for me, I want to know how the characters got where they are. I want to know why they're dealing with the stuff that they're dealing with, not just the fact that, hey, these guys are dealing with this. I enjoyed the drawing, but I didn't enjoy the storyline. I know I'm probably going to get a bunch of people mad at me because a bunch of people really like this, but since I read a lot of fantasy and I'm used to all that world building, I can't deal with this. So I don't know if I'm going to continue on with that series or not. I mean, if somebody buys me the next one, like for Christmas or something, because that was actually a gift for my boyfriend. Somebody gave that to him for his birthday or Christmas, I don't remember which. So we didn't actually buy that, it was a gift. So if somebody gifts us the second one, then I might check it out. but I'm not going to actively read anything else from that series. Now on to the books that I read in September. The first one is A Light in the Attic by Shel Silverstein, and I actually enjoyed this a lot more than Where the Sidewalk Ends. Where the Sidewalk Ends has a lot of these little, like, 4-line poems that are just kind of like, what? Why is this even here? It makes no sense. There's no real story to it. There's nothing that's a reason for why the poem would be in the book, or like anything that it would teach or anything like that. And this one doesn't have nearly as many of those. So I enjoyed this one a lot more, even though there's a few poems from Where the Sidewalk Ends that are iconic from my childhood and that I'll always love. I actually enjoyed this one more, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I have is Unite Me, which has the Shatter Me novellas Destroy Me and Fracture Me, and a little bit of Juliet's Journal, and they're by Tahira Mafi. Destroy Me follows Warner, and it goes from not the end of Shatter Me, but a little before the end. It's the last thing that you see of Warner in Shatter Me is where Destroy Me starts. And I really enjoyed this. I actually am very glad that I read this after I finished the trilogy. There's a few things in this that if you read it before you read Unravel Me, it would kind of spoil a few things. I understand that it's made to be read after Shatter Me, but for me it was better that I read it after the trilogy. It gives you a lot of insight in who Warner really is, because of course people don't always show their true selves to everybody around them, and the Shatter Me trilogy is based on Juliet's point of view, so it's how she views him, and this is from his perspective, so it gives a better look into Warner, which I really enjoyed. Fracture Me follows Adam, and this starts at the end of Ignite Me. I can't really say much about it because if you haven't read the books, then it'll spoil things for you, but Adam really annoyed me in this. So in the first book I really liked Adam, and in the second book he started getting like a little annoying, but in this he was incredibly annoying. I hated reading from his perspective. I absolutely hated reading from his perspective, and that's all I have to say about that. Now, the one thing that I really enjoyed was Juliet's journal. I absolutely love the fact that her journal was part of this. For somebody who, whenever they were younger, was asked, like, why don't you kill yourself? I wish you'd never been born. Like, you can never do anything right, and just constantly put down. This can be a huge trigger for you. It kind of was for me. And it kind of put me back in that state of mind that I was in when all those things were happening to me. So I really understand where Juliet's coming from in this. Yeah, just be aware that if you're in that situation, which if you are, I'm really sorry for you. I've been in that situation, and I've gotten out of it, I can't say gotten past it, but I have gotten myself out of being in a situation that people are doing that to me, and this brought me back to that. So if you are currently in that situation, this might be really hard for you to read. Overall, I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars, and I absolutely love this book. Now, I am doing this before work, and I am running out of time, so I will pick this up again tomorrow, and I'm going to look differently, so I will cut to that right here. And I'm back. The next book is Fortunately the Milk by Neil Gaiman, and I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. It follows a dad who goes to get milk, and apparently he has an adventure. The whole story kind of aggravated me,
because whenever I was little, I actually had to wait for my parents to get home, and sometimes we were waiting for a long time, just like the kids in this book. That's not real life. Like, they don't have, like, adventures like that. I know it's a kid's book and it's supposed to be funny, but it just kind of bugged me. The next book is Coraline, also by Neil Gaiman. Believe it or not, this is the first time that I've read this book. I watched the movie several times. I love claymation movies, and whenever it came out, I couldn't help myself. But I didn't know it was a book until I started following BookTube. I actually enjoyed this a lot more than the movie, and after reading this, the movie totally annoys me, which is kind of sad because I used to love the movie. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. The only thing is that I am a little too old for it. Even though I enjoyed it more than the movie, and I enjoy like watching cartoons, they're kind of ageless for me. With reading children's books, sometimes I can just really tell that it's a children's book versus like a cartoon. I know that sounds weird. I didn't really have any issues with anything with the book per se, other than that it was more for kids, I guess. It's actually creepier than the movie. The biggest problem that I had between the movie and the book, like the thing that made me really annoyed with the movie after reading the book, is Coraline in the movie is kind of a smartass. She's very condescending, she's very sarcastic. In the book, she's not portrayed that way. She's portrayed as a bored kid, but she never gets snarky like she does in the movie. The next book is A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness, and I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars. I don't have the nice, fun one with the monster on the cover and the illustrations inside. This one doesn't have any illustrations. So I don't know if that would have changed my view on the book, bumped it up to maybe 4.5 or something. It is a little childish. I know it's more of a middle grade, I think. I actually really enjoyed this. I would honestly recommend this for anybody who has a loved one who has cancer. I've never lost anybody to cancer. I've never really known anybody who was going through cancer in my lifetime. I have had friends who have died unexpectedly. That doesn't happen. I mean, she has cancer and it just drags on for a long time. But I think that this might give somebody some closure if they have somebody who has died from cancer. I love this book, and it is a really sad book. I think that this actually should be in every hospital library for kids to have access to, especially like cancer wards. It's very creepy, and I like creepy stuff. This would be a really good book to read during October, but it's also very sad, and it has a lot of love in it, and a lot of anger, and a lot of cancer. So, the next book I'm going to talk about, which I think was actually the first book I read in the month, but I wanted to save it towards the end, and that is Progeny of Gods, Virtue and Destiny by Jeffrey Storm. And I absolutely love this book. 5 out of 5 stars. It's fantasy, it's sci-fi, it has a lot of pop culture references, from some of it from the 90s. Like I've never played the Kingdom Hearts games, but he says that there's Kingdom Hearts references in it. He says there's Zelda references in it, which I've also never gotten to play Zelda. There's Star Wars references, which I actually know about, so I know that one. And there's also a little bit of Ferngully references in it, which is really cool because it's kind of an unknown movie now. This has a lot of action in it. The whole thing is a huge adventure. There's a lot of friendship involved, and there's just a little bit of romance. One thing I really enjoyed about this book is that the main bad guy that's portrayed in the book is Sticula. He battles with himself between good and evil, which is not something you usually see in a bad guy. The hero, which usually you see battling between good and evil, also has battles between good and evil within himself. So both the hero and the bad guy are battling within themselves between good and evil, which is really cool because not only are they battling each other, but they're also battling themselves, and it gives you a different view on just how you see people, because it kind of portrays that somebody's not just good and somebody's not just evil. There's good and evil in everybody, which I really enjoyed that about this. There's a lot of religious references in this, but there's several gods and several goddesses. It's not just like one god. I really like the fact that this book didn't just end on a huge cliffhanger. I mean, it kind of leaves you hanging, so it leaves you really wanting more, but it's not just like, oh my god, what's gonna happen kind of thing, which I hate in books, especially if it's going to be a while before the next book comes out, which I still don't know when book 2 is going to come out, so I'm waiting on that. The fact that it didn't leave me on a huge cliffhanger makes it where I don't really mind waiting so much, if you know what I mean. But I want to know more about the gods and the goddesses, and I want to know what happened at the end. There's another thing that I want to know about that involves one of the goddesses, but I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, so I'm not gonna say what that is. Actually, I'm going to have a separate full review video on this, and if you have read the book, you can check that out. I'm going to have a section at the beginning that has just basic review, so anybody can watch that part, and then I'll go into like my detailed thoughts on the book, which unless you just don't plan on reading the book, you won't want to watch that. Yeah, I'm going to do a separate review on this because I have lots of thoughts that I want to share, but they're kind of spoilery and I don't want to spoil people in my wrap-up. The last book that I read in September, I actually finished reading at 1 a.m. on the 1st, which I hadn't gone to bed yet, so I still consider that I read it in September, plus it was just like the last like 20 pages. This is part of my September wrap-up, even though I technically finished it in October. Yeah. That is Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. And I'd say this is one of my favorite books of the year. Progeny of Gods is definitely my favorite, but this is one of my favorites of the year, and I also gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. It's based in the future. There's like 3 different, I can't really say time periods. It's like there's the present, the real world present day, and then there's in the game present day, and then there's in the past, talking about things that happened in the past to the designer of the game. And sometimes that can be a huge make it or break it for a book, is if the author can actually transition between time periods or between different places in the world without having huge confusing. If they can actually have smooth transitions between them, then it can make a really good book, which that is the case in this. You go from real world to game time real world to finding out more about the designer of the game with a very smooth flow, and there's only a few times that it kind of jumps a little funky and it's just like slightly confusing, but it's not confusing enough that you go, what the hell just happened? So that is a major plus for me on this. It has the world building in it is really interesting because you have the characters' present day and explaining what's going on in the present day there. Then you have the game world and explaining what's going on in the game world. And you have going back into the 80s with the game designer and stuff that was going on in the 80s, which some of it's fictional, some of it's real, and it's all very interesting, especially if you're a little bit of a game geek. I was born in '84, so I remember like the end of the 80s and a whole bunch of stuff that was popular towards the end of the 80s, but my parents went to high school in the early 80s, so I kind of grew up with things that they liked from when they were teenagers. So I know more about the early 80s even though I didn't live through it because of them. The only kind of fault that I found a little bit with the book is that it says that the game designer was obsessed with the 80s and 80s pop culture and loved everything about the 80s, and that is something that they research for their quest for finding Easter eggs. The only thing that I didn't like is that not everything that is in the quest for the Easter eggs is based from the 80s. Some of it is they have biographies and stuff for the game designer. They say that it's referenced in there, but it's like late 70s stuff, and it's like, where is this late 70s stuff coming from when in the very beginning of the book you said it was like all 80s? And that's the only little problem that I had with the book. It was just a little annoying, as it felt like the author kind of lied in the beginning. It's like, okay, you said that he was obsessed with the 80s and all this 80s references in pop culture, and then all of a sudden, oh hey look, there's the stuff from the end of the 70s. I just felt like just a little bit betrayed on that one. But I like the references, and the geek in me like kind of geeked out. There's like Dungeons and Dragons and really old video games, which I've never seen the arcade for most of them, but I have some NES games that match some of them, so they don't have like all of the features that they show in the game or in the book. It's something that I can relate to because I actually have it. So that was really cool. And reading this after reading Attachments by Rainbow Rowell was really fun because I read that last month and reading this month. I'd actually kind of recommend reading them back to back. If you read Attachments and then read Ready Player One, it'd probably be better in that order, because I think reading Ready Player One and then reading Attachments, going from a contemporary to like a dystopian fantasy kind of thing, I think would be better than going from dystopian fantasy to a contemporary. Definitely recommend this book. I understand the hype in it. There's all kinds of hype surrounding this book. I'm glad I picked it up because I really enjoyed it. So that's all I have for my wrap up, and that's all I have for this video, so I'll see you next time.